I was a marine biologist yesterday. Today, I'm a merman chained in the cargo hold of a ruthless pirate king. In this world, my scales are worth a fortune, and being caught means certain death. I just saved the most dangerous man on the sea. Will he kill me or protect me? Let me tell you exactly how my life ended and then how it started again, in the worst possible way. It was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically, the way you remember small, useless details right before everything changes. Tuesday, I had a half-eaten granola bar on my desk, a stack of ungraded field reports, and a mug of coffee gone cold 3 hours ago. The lab smelled like salt water and formaldehyde, and the particular brand of exhaustion that only marine researchers understand. That bone-deep, satisfying kind of tired that means you've been in it all day. Nose down, hands wet, mind full. I was a PhD candidate, 28 years old, specializing in deep-sea bioluminescence and cephalopod communication, which in practical terms meant I spent most of my days talking to things that didn't talk back and finding that deeply comforting. People are complicated. The ocean makes sense. There are rules down there. Pressure, temperature, salinity gradients, photophores firing in sequence. Everything has a reason. Everything has a pattern. I liked patterns. I liked the ocean. What I did not like, what I had absolutely zero experience managing, was chaos, unpredictability, emotional exposure, the kind of raw animal vulnerability that happens when there's no protocol to fall back on. Which is, of course, exactly what I got. I don't know what the portal looked like from the outside. I wasn't outside. I was inside it, which is a very different experience and one I genuinely struggle to describe even now, even with everything I've seen since. It felt like being unmade. Not painfully, not all at once, more like, you know that moment in the ocean when a wave catches you wrong and pulls you under, and for just a second, you have no idea which way is up? That complete, total disorientation where your body forgets the rules. It was like that, but applied to every part of me, not just my sense of direction, my sense of self. One moment I was standing at my desk, the next I was underwater, and the next, and this is the part that took my brain several seconds to catch up with, I wasn't drowning. I should have been. I was submerged, fully submerged, no oxygen, no scuba gear, no preparation whatsoever. By every biological rule I had spent 6 years studying, my lungs should have been seizing, my body should have been panicking. The mammalian dive reflex should have kicked in, sure, but it only buys you a few minutes at best, and a few minutes wasn't going to be enough. But I wasn't drowning. I was breathing. Not the way you breathe air. It was different. Cooler, denser, this strange full sensation in my chest like every inhale was something more than simply oxygen, like the water itself was feeding me. I reached up instinctively and my fingers found gill slits along my neck, 3 on each side, fluttering with each breath, open and close, open and close. Completely involuntary, completely functional. I hung there in the water for a long moment just processing that. Gill slits, said the marine biologist part of my brain with an almost academic interest. Bilateral, likely teleost-derived morphology. Interesting. Then I looked down at my legs, or rather, where my legs used to be. The tail was okay. Okay, I need to take a breath here, even now, because describing this is harder than I expected. Not because it was horrifying, it wasn't, exactly. It was just so profoundly wrong in a way that my brain kept trying to reject it, like a file too large to open. From the hip down, I was a fish. Technically, and yes, I cataloged this because that's how I process things, and you deal with existential crises the way your brain is built to deal with them. Technically, the morphology was closer to a deep water species than anything coastal. The scales weren't the bright, decorative kind you see in fantasy illustrations. They were darker. Blue-black near the hip, shifting through deep teal and then into something that caught the light strangely, not quite silver, not quite green. Bioluminescent patches along the lateral line, currently dormant. The fin at the tail was wide and powerful, a strong crescent shape, the kind built for sustained deep-water propulsion rather than shallow sprinting. My hands found the scales automatically. The texture was It's hard to explain. From the outside, I later learned, they looked hard, armored even. But from the inside, every scale had sensation. I could feel the pressure of my own fingertips, warm despite the cold water, like touching my own skin. Because it was my own skin. That was the moment the shock fully hit. This wasn't a suit. This wasn't temporary. The nerve endings went all the way down. When I flexed, experimentally, terrified, the entire tail moved in one fluid, powerful sweep, and I felt it the way you feel your own arm moving. The proprioception was already there, already mapped, like my body had been living in this form for years, even though my mind had arrived approximately 45 seconds ago. I almost laughed. It came out as bubbles. Marine biologist, I thought, slightly hysterical. Of course you got the fish half. But then, the storm hit. I felt it before I heard it, a shift in pressure, a roiling disturbance in the water column above me that any marine creature would recognize as get low, get small, get out of the way. I looked up. Through the surface, distorted by the churn of waves, I could see the sky had turned the color of bruised metal. Lightning sheeted across it in long, flat pulses. The wind was screaming. I could hear it even underwater, a low, resonant moan that traveled through the hull of the ship above me. There was a ship above me. A big one. A sailing ship, old construction, with a deep draft and a double-keeled hull that cut down into the water like a blade. The kind of ship that doesn't exist anymore, or didn't where I came from. Here, in whatever world this was, it was clearly very real. I could see barnacles on the hull. I could see the anchor chain swaying in the surge. I should have swum away. Every logical instinct I had said, swim away, go deep, this is not your problem. But then, someone fell off the ship. He went over the side like a stone. No flailing, no cry, just there one moment and gone the next. I tracked his descent automatically, the way you track falling objects. He hit the surface hard. Wrong angle. Not a dive, a fall. And then he sank, and the storm surge pulled at him, and he didn't fight it. I don't know why I moved. I've tried to explain it to myself 100 times since, and I've never come up with an answer that fully satisfies me. It wasn't rational. It wasn't calculated. It was the same impulse that makes you reach out to catch a glass before it hits the floor. Pure, automatic, faster than thought. Maybe it was the marine biologist in me. Save the drowning creature. Get it to air. Maybe it was something else. Something about the way he fell. Not panicked, not thrashing. Already surrendered to it. The kind of fall that didn't look entirely like an accident. Maybe I just wasn't ready for the first living thing I saw in this world to die in front of me. I don't know. I went. The storm was stronger in the upper water column than I realized. The surge was violent, full of debris, broken rigging, a shattered crate, pieces of something I didn't want to look at too closely. My tail was powerful enough to navigate it, but only barely. The new instincts my body had arrived with were doing most of the work, while my conscious mind scrambled to catch up, like a student watching an expert and desperately taking notes. Banking left, dodge the rigging. Use the current, don't fight it. Watch the undertow. I found him about 12 feet down, sinking in a slow spiral. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, heavy with muscle and gear, leather armor, a sword still sheathed at his hip because there'd been no time to draw it. Dark hair spreading out around his head in the water, eyes closed. Face relaxed. He looked almost peaceful. That bothered me more than the drowning. I got beneath him and pushed upward, one arm across his chest, tail driving hard against the current. He was heavy and uncooperative in the way unconscious bodies always are, all dead weight and no core stability. The storm surge fought me the whole way up. I took a piece of debris across the shoulder that left a stripe of pain bright enough to make my vision white out for a moment, and I almost lost my grip, almost lost him. But I didn't. We broke the surface in the trough between two massive swells, and I hauled him up enough to get his face clear. He coughed. Once, twice. Violent, convulsive, the full body shudder of a body rejecting water. Still unconscious, but breathing. Breathing. The ship was 20 feet away, too far to throw him. I could see figures on the deck, shouting, throwing lines. The ropes fell short in the wind. I made a decision. I swam him to the hull, positioned him against a lowered rope net that had been left hanging over the side, ladder rigging, frayed but intact, and I got him onto it. Got his hands around the ropes, his fingers curled instinctively, grip responding even through the unconscious, and I felt something release in my chest that I didn't have time to examine. There, he's on. He's got it. He'll be pulled up. I should have been gone before anyone looked over the side. I wasn't fast enough. The first crossbow bolt hit the water 6 inches from my shoulder. I went still. It's an instinct in the ocean. Sudden loud noise, sudden impact. You go still and you assess. And what I assessed in about 2.5 seconds was 5 crossbows aimed at me from the deck railing. 5 men, none of them small, all of them with the steady-handed calm of people who had aimed at living things before. The storm was still screaming around us, waves battering the hull, but these men held their positions like it wasn't even happening. "Don't move." The voice was deep, accented, commanding in the absolute bone-deep way of someone who never had to raise it to be obeyed. "Don't move, don't dive, and you won't get a bolt between those pretty eyes." There was a long pause in which I very seriously considered diving anyway. And then strong hands grabbed me from behind, from the water, from someone who had gone in to retrieve their captain and found me instead, and I was hauled upward, and the rope net was around me, and I was on the deck of the ship in the rain and the chaos of the storm, gasping for air that felt suddenly too thin, too dry, wrong in my lungs in a way that made breathing feel like a conscious effort instead of a reflex. Transitioning, some still functioning part of my brain noted. The gill slits are compensating, pulmonary exchange adapting. Give it a moment. I gave it a moment. On my back, on the heaving deck, with 5 crossbows and approximately 20 pairs of eyes on me, in the middle of a storm, in the body I hadn't had yesterday. I lay there, and I adapted. The chains came fast, heavy iron, salt-roughed, clamped around my wrists and then looped around what I was quickly learning was the load-bearing part of a merman's torso, the broadened hip structure where the tail joined the human abdomen. Effective, actually. I noted that with detached, involuntary professionalism. They've done this before. These weren't improvised restraints. Somebody on this ship had chained a merman before. That was not a comforting thought. They dragged me across the deck, not viciously, just efficiently, the way you move cargo, and dropped me through a hatch into the hold below. The darkness swallowed me. The hatch slammed. The bolt drove home. The storm raged on above, muffled now. The crack and roar of it filtered through thick wood. The hold smelled like bilge water and grain sacks, and the particular deep-sea cold that I was learning my new body found oddly comfortable. In the thin lines of light through the deck planks, I could see my own scales, still that deep shifting blue-black. The bioluminescent patches along my sides had woken up slightly in the stress, a faint, involuntary glow, like a lantern turned down very low. Great, I thought. You glow when you're scared. That's going to be useful. I lay there in the dark for what felt like a long time, cataloging, processing, running through everything I knew and trying to construct something like a picture of where I was and what kind of world I'd landed in. A world where mer people existed and were valuable enough to chain. A world where that crew had recognized what I was immediately, no hesitation, no disbelief, just trained reaction. A world where someone had built restraints specifically for this, which meant I was known here. My kind was known here. And if the reaction of those men was any indication, the way their eyes had moved over my scales with something that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with price, being known was not the same as being safe. The hatch opened again about an hour later. They weren't rough about it, efficient. 2 large men came down with a lantern between them, and behind them came a third, smaller figure carrying a wooden pail of seawater that they upended over me without ceremony. The relief was immediate and not something I'd expected. My skin had been drying in the bilge air, and the water felt like breathing, like the first breath after nearly drowning. So I need immersion. I filed that away. Intermittent, not constant, but the membrane needs it. The two large men left. The smaller figure lingered, holding the lantern up, studying me with an expression I couldn't read in the light. Young, sharp-faced, not cruel exactly, just calibrating, looking at me the way you look at something whose value you're trying to establish. "He's going to want to see it," the figure said to no one in particular, then left. He, the man I'd pulled from the water, the man whose hands had gripped that rope net even through unconsciousness, the man whose fall had looked, in that fractured, storm-lit moment, almost deliberate. I lay in the dark and thought about that. About what I'd seen in the 2 seconds between breaking the surface and being restrained. The face slack with unconsciousness, but still defined. A jaw like a ship's prow. A scar running from one cheekbone down and under the chin. A face that had been to war with something repeatedly and hadn't entirely won. A face that looked like it was used to pain. They brought him down sometime in the deep middle of the night, when the storm had softened to a steady, heavy rain. He could walk, barely. There was a careful quality to his movement that said ribs probably cracked on his way over the side. But he was upright, and he came down the ladder himself, and he didn't lean on the men behind him, even though it was clear he could have. He came down into the hold with a lantern in his own hand, and he stood at the bottom of the ladder, and he looked at me. Captain Thorne. I understood the name immediately, the way you sometimes understand things in this world without being told, like the language had arrived with the body, baked into the new architecture of my brain. Captain Thorne. Pirate King, the scourge of 3 seas. Names that moved through the shipping lanes the way his ship moved through the water, fast and leaving damage in their wake. He was bigger up close. I'd registered broad shoulders in the water, but up close the scale of him was different. The kind of large that comes from decades of physical work and combat, layered and functional. He wore no coat right now, just a linen shirt gone dark with water at the shoulders and cuffs, open at the throat. The scar on his jaw was silvered with age. There were others, at the wrist, along the side of the neck, a knotted one on the back of his left hand that had the specific geometry of a blade wound. He wore them like a record of everything that had tried to kill him and hadn't managed it. His eyes were gray. Not a soft gray, not a gentle gray. The gray of deep water in winter, that particular shade that has both cold and depth in it, that looks still on the surface and has something completely different going on underneath. He looked at me for a long time without speaking. His expression was not what I expected. I'd braced for contempt, for calculation, for the flat transactional assessment of someone deciding what I was worth. And there was some of that, yes. This was clearly a man who lived by transactions, who had made a science of measuring value. But there was something else, too, underneath it. He'd looked at me before, on that deck, in the storm. For 2 seconds, he'd been conscious for those 2 seconds, I understood now. He'd been conscious when I was restrained, when the chains went on, when they dragged me to this hatch. He'd seen it. He'd let it happen. And now he was standing in his own hold in the middle of the night with cracked ribs and soaked hair, holding a lantern over me with an expression that, just for a moment, before his face closed over it like a wave closing over a stone, looked almost like something I'd call guilty. The lantern light caught my bioluminescence. The glow along my lateral line brightened involuntarily in response to the attention, a fear response I was learning, my own body betraying my emotional state in light. Thorne watched it happen. His jaw tightened slightly. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was the same as I'd heard on deck, deep, controlled, but quieter now, not a performance, just a statement laid between us like something he was still deciding what to do with. I held his gaze. "I know," I said. The air in the hold changed. Something shifted. I could feel it, the way you feel a change in current before it reaches you. He hadn't expected me to speak. Or maybe he'd expected it differently, servile, afraid, something he could categorize and dismiss. My voice came out flat and even, the way it always did when I was frightened and functioning anyway, all the emotion compressed down into nothing. And whatever he'd been braced for, it wasn't that. His eyes stayed on mine, gray and deep and complicated, with that thing underneath, that current I couldn't name yet. The glow along my sides pulsed once, slow like a breath. Neither of us looked away. Here is what I knew about Captain Torn by the end of the first night. His crew was afraid of him, not the performance fear of men who respect authority, the real kind, the kind that lives in the body. I could hear it in the way their footsteps changed on the deck above me when he appeared. That specific shift from loose to careful, the way weight redistributes when you're trying to take up less space without looking like you're trying. His ship was called the Wraith. I learned that from the two men who brought my second bucket of water. They said the name the way religious people say the name of something they both worship and fear. He had not, as far as I could tell, slept. All night, through the slow hours after he'd come down to the hold, I heard his boots on the deck above me. Back and forth, back and forth. The specific rhythm of a man carrying something he couldn't put down. And here is the thing I did not know, could not have predicted, and still have not fully rationalized. On the morning of the second day, he moved me to his cabin. Not gently exactly, it wasn't gentle. Nothing about the process of being carried through a ship in chains while a crew of hardened pirates tried very hard not to look directly at you qualifies as gentle. But it was careful. There's a difference. Gentle is soft. Careful is deliberate. It means someone is paying attention, making choices, applying effort to the task of not causing damage. The tank was already there when they brought me in. That was the thing that stopped me cold. Stopped me from cataloging exits and assessing threat vectors and running all the logical protocols I'd been running since the moment those chains went on. The tank was already there. Not a barrel, not a bilge container pressed into service. An actual tank, long and deep, made of dark-stained wood with iron banding, lined inside with what looked like oiled canvas to hold the water. It was built into the far wall of the cabin like it had always been there, like it was part of the room's original architecture. He planned this. That was my first thought. He knew. He had this ready. My second thought was considerably less logical, and I'm not going to examine it too closely even now. He knew, and he made it big enough to be comfortable. The water they'd filled it with was clean, cold, salt-mixed, the right density. Someone had been deliberate about that, too. I went in with all the grace of a man being lowered into a bathtub by strangers while wearing chains, which is to say, none at all. And for a moment, the indignity of it overwhelmed everything else. Then the water closed over my tail, and every scale settled, and my gills opened fully for the first time since they'd pulled me onto the deck, and I stopped thinking about dignity entirely. Thorn dismissed the men without looking at them. He had that particular captain's trick of issuing commands in the same tone he used for everything else. No escalation, no performance. Leave us. 2 words. The door closed. We were alone, and the room went quiet except for the creak of the ship and the thin sound of water. He stood across the cabin at the large desk that dominated the center of the room, with his back to me. He was reading something, or pretending to. The line of his shoulders was the careful kind of still, the kind that costs effort. I watched him from the tank and said nothing. I'd learned something the night before. Silence was leverage. He'd expected me to beg or threaten or negotiate frantically. I hadn't done any of those things. I'd answered him in a flat, even voice and held his gaze, and something in that had shifted the room in a way I was still mapping. So I waited. He turned around eventually, holding a wooden bowl. He walked to the tank without preamble, pulled a chair over with one foot, the unconscious economy of someone who's used to having both hands occupied, and sat down. He put the bowl on the edge of the tank. I looked at it. Fish. Cooked, which I hadn't expected. Something about the aromatics, herbs I didn't recognize, the smell of a galley that took its work seriously. Next to the fish, something that looked like a citrus fruit, split open. I looked at him. He looked at me. His face was doing the closed thing, the careful, nothing-moving arrangement that I was starting to understand was his default. But there was something in the set of his mouth, something slightly uncertain that the rest of his face hadn't gotten the message to hide. "You need to eat," he said. "I have hands," I said. A pause. "The chains," he said. Something moved through his expression and was gone. "They stay on until I decide otherwise." He picked up a piece of the fish and held it out. I stared at him for a long moment. The marine biologist in me was composing a quiet, thorough protest about autonomy and the ethics of... I was also extremely hungry. I leaned forward and took it from his fingers. His hand didn't move away immediately. That was the thing I noticed, the small, involuntary pause before he pulled back. Like his hand had made a decision, his brain was still catching up. His fingertips had brushed the edge of my lip in the transfer, and the touch was... I don't have a clear scientific explanation for what happened next. My bioluminescence lit up. Not the stress flicker from the hold, something different, warmer, slower. A pulse that started at my collarbone and moved down through the lateral line like a slow wave. And I felt it happening and could not stop it and wanted very badly to be somewhere this man could not see my face. He saw it anyway. Something changed in his eyes. Barely a fractional shift, like a compass needle adjusting. He reached for another piece of fish, and this time he was slower about the transfer. Not crueler, slower. Like he was paying more attention. "Don't," I told myself. "He has you chained. He's a pirate. He very possibly intends to sell you. This is not..." His thumb grazed the inside of my wrist, just above the chain cuff in passing. Probably an accident. Almost certainly an accident. My heart did something I'm going to describe as a structural irregularity and move past. We developed a rhythm across those first days, though neither of us named it or acknowledged it directly. That was, I came to understand, how Thorn operated. He would not name a thing until he was certain of it, and possibly not even then. He was a man who lived in the space between words, in the things he didn't say. And I was a man who cataloged and documented and labeled everything, and we were therefore operating in completely opposite frameworks, which should have made everything harder than it did. It didn't make it harder. I don't know why. He came to the cabin 3 times a day, always alone. He fed me, always by hand, always with that same quality of attention, like the act of it mattered to him in some way he hadn't decided how to categorize. He asked questions, careful ones, the way you test ice, 1 foot at a time, waiting to hear if it holds. What did I eat in the water? Did cold temperatures affect me? What were the lights, the bioluminescence he hadn't asked directly, but I could feel the current underneath every other question like a current? I answered carefully, not deceptively. I'm not built for sustained deception. My face does things I can't control, and apparently my entire body does too. But carefully. I gave him real answers and watched what he did with them, watched how he filed information, what he returned to, what he let go. He was intelligent. That landed differently than I expected. Ruthless men in stories are often stupid, or at least blunt. Their power is physical, their strategy is force. Thorn was neither of those things. He was one of the sharpest minds I'd encountered in either world, and he wore it the way he wore everything else. Quietly, conservatively, giving nothing away until he decided it was useful. On the 3rd day, he brought a book. He sat in the chair by my tank and he read, which I cannot explain why this undid something in me that the feeding and the careful hands had not. But there was something about the way he sat there. In the low light of the cabin lantern, one angle crossed over his knee, completely absorbed, that felt so profoundly human that it scraped against something tender inside me. He wasn't performing. Nobody performs like that when they're alone. And we were alone, which meant for the space of that hour, the Pirate King was just a man, reading, next to a tank where another strange, improbable creature floated in the half-dark and tried very hard not to feel things. I felt things. On the 4th night, I woke to the sound of him not sleeping again. The ship was quiet. The night watch above was minimal. I'd learned the rhythms of the deck by then, the pattern of footsteps, who walked heavy and who walked light, what the different sequences meant. It was the deep dead of night, the part where the ocean goes so quiet it feels like held breath. And Thorn was sitting in the chair, not reading, not working, just sitting, in the dark, with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. The lantern was turned down to almost nothing, just a thread of warm light, enough to see by, barely. In it, the lines of his face were different than in the day. The careful arrangement of his expression, all the controlled nothing, had slipped in the dark the way masks do when their wearer forgets to hold them. He looked tired. Not physically, though he was that too. Tired the way certain people get tired underneath everything, in some structural, foundational way that sleep doesn't touch. The kind of exhaustion that means a person has been carrying something alone for a very long time. The scar on his jaw looked different at this angle. Older. I found myself wanting to know its story, and being aware that wanting to know its story was a significant problem. I was quiet for a long moment. "You're gonna ruin your back sleeping in that chair," I said softly. He lifted his face from his hands. In the near dark, his gray eyes found me without effort, like he'd known I was awake. I wasn't sleeping. "I know." He looked at me. I looked at him. The lantern made very little light, and the water in my tank made very little sound. And somewhere very far below us, the ocean went on being enormous and indifferent. "Does it hurt?" he asked. His voice was different this late, lower, the performance roughness gone, something more unguarded underneath. "The chains." There was a long pause in which I considered the honest answer and the strategic answer and realized they were the same answer. Not as much as he'd think, but yes. He stood up. He crossed to the tank in 3 steps and crouched at the edge of it, and he reached into the water and took my chained wrist in both hands. Not forceful, not restraining, the opposite of that. His thumb found the skin above the cuff, the place where the metal had left a mark, and pressed there lightly, feeling the pulse, or the damage, or both. His hands were very warm. Mine, I realized, were shaking slightly. "I'm going to take the chains off," he said quietly. "In the morning, when the men can see I've made a decision about it." I looked at his face, close enough now that I could see the specific gray of his eyes in the dark, and underneath that current again, that thing I couldn't name. It looked, from this angle, in this light, like something he was afraid of. "Why?" I asked. His thumb moved, one slow pass over the bruised skin at my wrist, like an apology his mouth hadn't figured out how to make yet. "Because I saved your life, and I have very poor manners." Something in my chest cracked open the way ice cracks, not violently, slowly, with a soft, final sound that only I could hear. My bioluminescence came up warm and slow in the water, illuminating both our faces in that thin, teal-soft glow. Neither of us moved. Neither of us looked away. The ocean held its breath around us. The chains came off at dawn. Thorn did it himself, not a crewman, not the sharp-faced young lieutenant I'd started to identify as his second. Him, personally, with a key he kept on his own belt and hands that were steady in the way of someone who has made a decision and closed the door behind it. The crew watched from the deck above through the cabin's small porthole. I could feel them watching the way you feel weather coming, a pressure change, a collective held breath. He didn't explain himself to them. That, I was learning, was the specific texture of his authority. He didn't justify, he decided, and the world rearranged itself around the decision, and anyone who took issue with the rearrangement was invited to bring it to him directly, which no one ever did. The cuffs opened. I brought my wrists to my chest and held them there, feeling the blood move differently through hands that were suddenly entirely my own again. Thorn watched me do it. His face was the careful nothing, but his jaw worked once, briefly, the way it did when something got through the arrangement and he was managing it back down. "Thank you," I said. "Don't," he said. Not unkindly, like the gratitude made something difficult for him that he hadn't budgeted for. I filed that away and said nothing else. The storm announced itself 6 hours later. Not with subtlety. The barometric pressure dropped like something had knocked it off a shelf. Sudden, total, the kind of drop that makes your ears ache and your animal brain start looking for high ground. I felt it in the tank before anyone felt it on deck. Felt it the way my new body felt everything oceanic, not as information processed by the mind, but as sensation absorbed by the body, immediate and certain. I sat up in the tank. Above me, the ship reacted. The orderly stomp of working boots became something faster, more urgent. Commands went up the chain in quick succession, Thorne's voice carrying over all of them. Not louder, just clearer. The kind of clarity that cuts through noise the way a ship's prow cuts through water. I heard the sails being sheeted in, heard the anchor watch called back, heard, underneath all of it, the ocean beginning its low, building conversation with the sky. The first wave hit the ship like a closed fist. I went underwater instinctively as the tank sloshed, went under and felt, through the hull, through the wood and iron and ocean between me and the open water, what was coming. It was bad. Not a squall, not the structural inconvenience of the storm I'd arrived in. This was something with intention to it, something that had been building for days in the deep water and was now arriving at the surface with everything it had accumulated. I could feel the swell pattern, the rotational current, the specific geometry of a system that had organized itself into something the size of several cities. In my previous life, I would have given a great deal to study it. In this life, I was on a wooden ship directly in its path. I got out of the tank. This is the part where my decisions stopped being logical, and I have to be honest about that. The logical decision was to stay in the tank, stay in the cabin, stay invisible and unchained and grateful, and let the men above me manage their own crisis. I was cargo. I was a complication. I had every rational reason to stay exactly where I was. I got out of the tank, and I went up the ladder, and I pushed open the hatch into the storm. The deck was chaos, organized by habit. Men moved across it in practiced patterns, fighting the motion of the ship, hands on lines, boots finding purchase on wet wood by memory rather than sight. The rain was horizontal. The sky had gone the color of a bruise left by something enormous, and the waves were wrong. The kind of wrong that only looks wrong if you know what right is supposed to look like, if you understand the fluid mechanics underneath the spectacle. The ship was going to lose this, not all at once, but the angle of the swells relative to the hull was building a resonance pattern that would, within 20 minutes, be past the point of correction by sail or rudder alone. I could see it in the water the way an architect can see a structural failure coming in a building. The load is wrong, the stress is distributed badly, and the next significant input will find the weakest point. I pulled myself onto the deck on both hands, tail driving, and I went to the starboard rail. Nobody noticed me for approximately 4 seconds, which was enough time to get my hands over the rail and into the water and do the thing I hadn't known I could do until the moment I did it. I don't have a good scientific framework for what happened next. I'm working on building one, but I'm not there yet. The closest I can get is this. The water responded to me. Not metaphorically, physically, measurably, the way iron responds to a magnet or the way a tuning fork responds to its own frequency. When my hands went in, something in the bioluminescent network of my body sent a signal outward through the water column, and the water listened. I pushed against the swell, against the resonance pattern. I found the frequency the storm was running at, and I gave the water something to push against. A countercurrent, a redirect, not enough to stop the storm, but enough to change the angle of attack on the hull. The waves didn't calm, but they stopped being aimed. The light came with it. It always does. I can't separate the ability from the visibility, which is the design flaw in my biology I have had the most cause to resent. The bioluminescence came up like a sunrise. Not just the lateral line, but everything, every scale catching and amplifying. My hands in the water sending light out in pulses that the storm tossed up and scattered into the rain. I was lit from the inside like a lantern dropped into the ocean, and there was absolutely nothing subtle about it. Every man on deck stopped moving. In the middle of a life-threatening storm, 20 hardened pirates stopped what they were doing and stared at me. I kept my hands in the water. I did not look away from the waves. I heard Thorn's voice, sharp, immediate, directed at the men. A command. Then another. The men didn't move. Then someone said, low and ugly and carrying clearly over the storm, "The creature's doing something to the ship. It's cursed us." And the situation went from complicated to dangerous in the span of a single breath. I heard the sword clear its scabbard before I could turn. What I did not hear, what I felt as a wall of warmth at my back, sudden and absolute, was Thorn stepping between me and the blade. "Put it away." 3 words. The storm roared, the ship pitched, and those 3 words landed on the deck like they weighed more than everything else combined. The swordsman, one of the larger crew members, a man with a long career of violence written on his face, didn't put it away. "Captain, the creature is saving your life and mine again. Put it away." A long moment, the kind of moment that has a before and an after. The sword went back. Thorn didn't move from where he stood, his back to me, his shoulders squared to his crew, and I could see the specific set of his spine. Not aggressive, not uncertain, just fixed, immovable. A man planting himself in a position and communicating through every line of his body that this position was not subject to negotiation. The storm took another 30 minutes to break. I kept my hands in the water the whole time. Thorn stayed where he was, at my back, the whole time. Neither of us said anything. We didn't have to. The aftermath of a storm is its own specific silence. Not peaceful, the opposite of peaceful. It's the silence of a held breath finally released, of a body checking itself for damage, of a ship that has been through something and is still, improbably, whole. The crew found things to do. They found them with the focused efficiency of men who needed to move their bodies after being afraid and were grateful for the work. Nobody looked at me directly. 1 or 2 of them looked at Thorn in a way that said, "This conversation isn't finished." And Thorn received those looks with the flat, gray patience of a man who had navigated crew politics through pure force of presence for a long time and was entirely prepared to do it again. He turned to me finally, when the deck had cleared. I was on my side against the rail, my hands out of the water, my arms spent, the bioluminescence fading down to its dim resting glow. The exertion had cost more than I'd expected, and there was a gash on my arm from something in the storm's debris that I hadn't noticed while it was happening and was very much noticing now. The rain had cleaned it, but it was deep, and it was bleeding in the thin, slow way that meant it would keep going for a while. Thorn looked at my arm. Something moved across his face, fast and unguarded, the mask slipping clean off for a half-second before it went back up. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I don't walk," I said. A pause. "Can you move?" "Yes." He crouched down, and before I could do anything with the information that this was happening, he had an arm under my back and another under the curve of my tail, and he lifted me with the unhurried certainty of someone who had assessed the weight and found it manageable, and he carried me back to the hatch. I stared at the side of his face the entire way. He did not look down at me. His jaw was very tight. He put me back in the tank, and then he got a medical kit from somewhere, and he pulled his chair to the edge of the water, and he reached in and took my arm and cleaned the wound with the focused, precise attention of a man who has dressed a great many injuries and has opinions about how it should be done. I watched his hands. I had developed, over the past few days, an involuntary and highly inconvenient habit of watching his hands. They were careful hands, controlled. The same hands that issued commands and settled debts, and presumably had done the things that built his reputation, and they moved over my arm like I was something that required protecting, and I could not reconcile those 2 facts. And I was starting to think that was the point, that maybe they weren't 2 facts, maybe they were 1. "You knew," I said quietly. He didn't look up. "Knew what?" "That it was me, on the beach." I watched his hands still briefly, then continue. "Before this, When I pulled you out of the water, that wasn't here. That wasn't this ship. It was earlier, before I was caught. I kept my voice even. You said I saved your life. But the crew that found me, they came from a different direction. They didn't see the rescue. But you said it like you already knew. His hands stopped. The lantern was warm and low between us, and the aftermath of the storm pressed the silence down close, and he looked up at me for the first time since we'd come back inside. Yes, he said. One word, weighted like a full sentence, like a door opening. How long? I asked. Since the hold. His voice was quiet. Your eyes. A pause in which I watched something move through the deep gray of his gaze. I don't forget a face, or eyes. Another pause, shorter. I was conscious on the net, for a few seconds. Enough. He had looked at me in the water, in the arms of a stranger, half drowned in a storm, and he had remembered. Through hours of unconsciousness and the chaos of capture and a full night in the hold, he had carried that image and recognized me. My throat was doing something difficult.
I had the tank ready, he said like he was confessing something. Before we brought you up, I sent men ahead. He looked back at my arm, resumed his work, slower now. It wasn't a coincidence. You protected me, I said softly, even before you decided to. His jaw moved. The scar on his jaw caught the lantern light. When he spoke, his voice was lower than I'd heard it, stripped down to something undefended. You pulled me out of the water, he said, when you had no reason to, when the smart thing, the safe thing, was to go deep and let me sink. His thumb pressed gently around the edge of the wound, checking the edges. I've been at sea for 20 years. Nobody has ever. He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He turned my arm carefully and pressed clean cloth to the gash and held it there with both hands, and the pressure was exactly right, firm and steady and warm, and I felt my scales flush bright in the water, and I watched his face soften the way I'd only seen it soften in the deep dark of the night watch, and I thought, there he is. There is the person that all of that armor is for. It's going to scar, he said, about the wound. I know, I said. He nodded once like we'd agreed on something larger than that. Outside, the ocean lay quiet. The crew moved through their repairs above us, and the ship listed gently in the calm after the storm. And in the warm lantern dark of the captain's cabin, the most dangerous man on 3 seas held my injured arm in both hands like it was something he was determined not to lose. My bioluminescence settled into a steady, soft glow. The color, I noticed, was warm. It hadn't been warm before. I want to tell you something about violence. I've studied predator-prey dynamics for 6 years. I understand the mechanics of it, the biomechanics of attack, the neurochemistry of the freeze response, and the evolutionary logic of aggression. I can describe a shark strike in anatomical terms. I can tell you exactly what happens to a body under extreme duress. None of that prepared me for watching Thorn fight. The sovereign fang came out of the pre-dawn dark like something that had been waiting in it. No lights, no warning shot, just the sudden massive reality of another ship materializing from the darkness off the port bow, already close enough that I could hear voices on her deck, and then the grappling hooks came over the rail in a cascade of iron and rope, and the night exploded. I heard it from the tank before I saw it. Felt it, really, the concussive thump of hulls making contact, transmitted through the water like a struck bell. Then the hatch above slammed open, and a crewman I recognized, young, quick-handed, the one who'd been least hostile to my presence, dropped halfway down the ladder and looked at me with the wide, urgent eyes of someone conveying important information under time pressure. "Stay in the tank," he said. "Stay in the tank and don't make light." He was gone before I could respond. I pulled myself to the edge of the tank and looked up through the open hatch at a rectangle of dark sky gone orange with torchlight. I could hear it all, the crack of pistols, the specific percussion of blades, the human sounds of men hitting the deck. boots everywhere, an entire vocabulary of footsteps that I'd learned to read over the past days, and now running completely wrong, too fast, too many, from the wrong directions. I stayed in the tank for approximately 4 minutes. Then I heard Thorn's voice. Not the command voice, not the quiet authority voice, but something short and sharp that my body recognized as pain before my brain had finished processing the sound, and I was out of the tank and up the ladder before I made a conscious decision about any of it. The deck was a painting in firelight and shadow and motion. The Sovereign Fang's crew had boarded in numbers, 30 men at least, more still coming over the rails, and they were good. Not Wraith crew good, but coordinated, working in pairs, driving Thorn's men back towards the stern in a controlled compression that I recognized, even with no military training, as a tactic. Not a raid, a capture. They were trying to take the ship intact. Thorn was at the center of it. This is the part I want to describe, right? So stay with me, because what I saw on that deck rearranged something in my understanding of what a human body is capable of when it has been tested for 20 years and has decided that today is not the day. He moved like water moves, not the calm surface kind, the deep kind, the kind with mass and direction and an absolute indifference to obstacles. He had a sword in his right hand and a blade I didn't have a name for in his left, shorter and curved. And he used them in alternating rhythm the way you use 2 oars, each stroke setting up the next. No wasted motion, no dramatic excess. He wasn't performing. That was the thing that hit me hardest. There was no theater in it, just efficiency, applied at speed with the total commitment of a man who has made his peace with what he is. 3 attackers came at him from different angles. He redirected the first with his forearm, took the hit, used the momentum, turned it into a pivot, caught the second on the short blade, and put the third on the deck with an elbow strike that sounded like a door slamming. 5 seconds. 3 opponents. He was already moving to the next engagement before any of them had finished falling. I gripped the rail and watched and understood, fully and finally, how he had survived 20 years of this. Then one of the boarders saw me. The shout that went up was not in a language I had words for, but the meaning translated instantly, the universal human frequency of, "There, that thing, get it." And 3 men peeled away from the main fight and came toward the hatch, toward the cabin, toward the tank. I registered the tactical logic in the same detached, functioning part of my brain that always stays online. They knew what I was, or they'd heard, and in this world, that meant I was the most valuable thing on the ship, and taking me meant leverage or profit, or both. I also registered with perfect clarity that I was half out of water, unchained, and alone. So I sang. I didn't know I could do it. I want to be straight about that. This wasn't calculated, wasn't a plan. It was the same instinct that had driven me into the storm water to push back the swells, the same below-conscious response of a body that knew things its mind hadn't caught up to yet. The sound that came out of me was nothing like singing in the human sense. Not melodic, not structured, not the kind of thing you hum. It was a frequency. A deep, resonant frequency that lived in the chest and the throat and the water simultaneously, that moved through the hull of the ship the way my bioluminescence moved through the water. It bypassed the ears entirely and went straight to the nervous system. The 3 men coming toward the hatch stopped. Then the men fighting nearest the hatch stopped. It spread in a wave, not stopping the whole battle, the distance was too great, but creating a zone of sudden confused stillness around the stern, around the cabin, around me. Men who'd been mid-swing stood with weapons raised and eyes gone vague and wondering. The 2 boarders still on their feet blinked at me with expressions that had gone entirely soft, like something very loud had stopped, and the silence afterward was so complete they'd forgotten where they were. I stopped singing. My throat ached with it. I looked up. Thorn was looking at me from across the deck. Not with the vague, suspended expression of the men the song had reached. He'd been too far, or too anchored, or perhaps something else entirely that kept him present. He was looking at me with his chest heaving and a cut over one eye painting half his face in red, and an expression I had no framework for. Not fear, not awe, something more complicated than either. Something that looked like a man seeing something for the first time that he'd been looking for without knowing it. He moved. Across the deck, through the disrupted battle, directly to me, and the men in his path got out of it. His own crew by training, the stunned boarders by simple self-preservation instinct, all of them clearing before him like water before a prow. He stopped at the hatch, 6 inches between us, close enough that I could see the cut clearly, the blood tracking down the line of his jaw, following the old scar like water following a familiar channel. "You're out of the water," he said. "I was losing," I said. I was managing, but his voice had no argument in it. The battle was reorganizing around us. The stunned pause my song had created was dissolving, both crews shaking off the resonance, the Fang's men remembering their objectives. There were shouts, "Steal again." The window was closing. His eyes hadn't left mine. "Go back inside," he said. "Get back in the tank." "No." A beat. 2. "No?" he repeated, and something in his voice shifted. Not anger, something that moved through the same space anger would occupy, but was an entirely different substance. "I'm not going back in the tank while you're bleeding on my deck," I said, and did not examine what my deck meant, did not examine any of the choices my mouth was making without supervision, because we didn't have time for examination right now. His jaw tightened. The cut leaked. His gray eyes were enormous in the firelight, storm gray, deep water gray, and they were looking at me like I'd said something that mattered. "Then stay behind me," he said. "Then don't get in front of me," I said. He looked at me for one more second. Then he put his hand on the back of my neck, one hand, warm and solid and certain, and pressed his forehead against mine, and for 3 seconds in the middle of a battle on a burning lit deck with 30 men trying to kill him, Thorn closed his eyes. I closed mine. "We live or we don't," he said quietly against my forehead. His voice was stripped of everything, the authority, the control, the careful construction of it. Just his voice, just the words. "But we don't split up, agreed?" My hand found his wrist, both my hands actually, circling it, holding on. "Agreed," I said. He opened his eyes. I opened mine. And then he turned back to the battle, and I turned with him, and my bioluminescence came up to full, not the fear flicker, not the warm pulse, but something total and blazing and outward directed, light pouring off me in waves that turned the deck around us into something that looked nothing like a ship and everything like the deep ocean floor, and I sang again, low and directed at the 3 men about to hit Thorn's blindside. They stopped. Thorn took the opening without a moment's hesitation, like we'd drilled it, like we'd done this 100 times before. We hadn't. We hadn't done anything together except survive. But somehow, we already knew how the other one moved. The Sovereign Fang retreated when her captain went down. Not dead. Thorn had made a choice about that, visible and deliberate in front of both crews. He could have killed him. He chose not to. He put the man on the deck and left him breathing and stepped back. And every sailor watching understood the statement being made. I could. I chose mercy. Remember that mercy has an author. The grappling hooks were cut. The Fang drifted. The orange light on the water dimmed as her torches guttered. The deck was wrecked. Lines down, blood on the boards, 2 of Thorn's crew badly hurt, 3 of the Fang's men taken prisoner. The ordinary catastrophe of a battle survived. I was on the deck, propped against the rail, drained in the specific way that using whatever ability lived in me left me. Not hurt, not damaged, just emptied out. My glow had faded down to almost nothing. My arms were shaking. The night air was cold on wet skin, and I was aware, distantly, that I needed water. Thorn crouched in front of me. He was still bleeding. He'd taken another hit during the final push, something to the side. His hand was pressed against his ribs with the careful, practiced pressure of a man managing pain he doesn't have time for. His shirt was ruined. His hair was loose, salt-soaked and dark. He was the most tired I'd ever seen him, and he was looking at me the same way he'd looked at me with his forehead against mine. Everything stripped down, everything laid out, no management left.
He reached out and pushed wet hair from my face. The gesture was so quiet against everything that had just happened that it took my breath away. "You're cold," he said. "I'm fine." "You're shaking." "So are you." He didn't argue that. He sat down against the rail beside me instead, not across from me, not crouching over me, beside me, his shoulder against mine, his weight solid and warm against my side. He tilted his head back against the rail and looked up at the sky where the clouds were finally, slowly, breaking apart. We said nothing. We didn't need to. His hand found mine on the deck between us. Not romantic, not yet, not quite, just contact, just wait. Just the specific, irreducible message of "I am here, and so are you," and that is, for the moment, enough. My fingers turned and held his. His grip tightened once, like a reflex, like something he hadn't decided to do. Above us, the stars came out, one at a time, the way things that have been hidden always eventually come out. Below us, the ocean moved on, indifferent and enormous and entirely unconcerned with what was happening on the small, battered ship at its surface, where two improbable creatures had just made each other a promise and kept it. I looked at the stars. I thought about patterns. I thought, I think I'm starting to understand this one. He gave me the key 3 days after the battle. Not dramatically, not with a speech. That wasn't how Thorn operated. I knew that by now. Knew the specific grammar of how he communicated the things that mattered most to him, which was quietly, practically, with the minimum number of words and the maximum amount of intention behind them. He said it on the edge of the tank in the morning, before the crew was fully awake, before the ship had shaken off the particular drowsy stillness of pre-dawn. He put it down with a small, definitive sound, metal on wood, and he didn't explain it, and he didn't look at me when he did it. He just set it down. And then he stood at his desk with his back to me, in the gray, early light, and he waited. I looked at the key for a long time. It was old, worn smooth at the bow from years of handling, the kind of wear that only comes from being carried, being touched, being kept close. This wasn't despair. This was the key, the one from his belt, the one he'd had on him every day since the chains went on, the one I'd been aware of the way you're aware of things that have power over you, a constant peripheral presence. He'd been carrying it next to his body for weeks. He was giving it to me. "This means I can go?" I said. "Yes," still not looking at me. "You're not going to stop me." A pause. 1 breath. 2. "No." "Thorn." I waited until he turned. His face was the careful nothing, but his eyes weren't. His eyes were the winter gray deep water, and underneath the surface everything was moving. Why? He was quiet for a long moment. The ship moved around us, the small sounds of it, rope and wood and water, and the first boots of the morning watch on the deck above. His jaw worked once. "Because you're not cargo," he said finally. "You were never—" He stopped. Tried again. "You pulled me out of the water. You stood on my deck in a storm with your hands full of lightning and saved 40 men who would have sold you to the highest bidder without thinking twice." Something moved across his face, fast and unguarded. "You sang pirates to sleep so I could keep breathing. You held my hand and counted stars with me while I was bleeding." His voice had gone very low. "You don't belong in a tank. You don't belong in chains." He held my gaze. "You belong to the ocean, so I'm giving you back to it." My throat had closed entirely. "And if I don't want to go back to it?" I asked. The stillness that moved through him was the most total stillness I'd ever seen in a human body. Like something had stopped, not in fear, but in the specific suspended quality of a man who has been bracing for an impact that has suddenly changed direction. "Then," he said carefully, like a man stepping onto untested ice, "you can stay."
I've thought about what happened next more times than I can count, and I still don't know how to explain the logic of it cleanly, so I'm going to stop trying to explain the logic and just tell you what happened. I knew in the abstract that the transformation was possible. My body had arrived in this world with certain capacities already loaded. The gills, the bioluminescence, the song, the instinctive affinity with water, and somewhere in that same inherited architecture there was this, the reverse of what had been done to me. A way back. I also knew from the deep cellular awareness of a body that understood itself better in this world than I'd ever understood it in the last, that it would hurt. Not a little. Not manageable, adjustable work through it hurt. The fundamental restructuring of bone and tissue and nerve, the closing of gill slits, the splitting and reorientation of a tail fin into two separate and functional human legs. This was the kind of pain that required a decision. You didn't do this accidentally. I looked at the key on the edge of the tank. I looked at Thorn. I thought about the ocean, the real, full, enormous ocean. The depth of it, the cold and the dark and the absolute freedom of water in every direction, the world I'd been dropped into, a body built for, the world that had been trying to swallow me since the first storm. I could go back to it right now. I could go back to it and dive deep enough that no ship ever found me, and I could live in the quiet the ocean kept, in the patterns and the pressure gradients and the clean sensory logic of a world without ambiguity. And I thought, but he's here. He's here, and I have watched the most dangerous man on 3 seas keep himself awake at night carrying the weight of things no one else knows he carries. I have watched his mask slip in the dark and seen what it's covering, and it is not cruelty. It is not coldness. It is the specific, exhausted loneliness of a person who has been powerful for so long that they've forgotten what it felt like to need someone. And he needs someone. And this is the part where the marine biologist in me finally, permanently loses the argument to the rest of me, I want to be that someone. I want it in the way you want oxygen, not as an idea, as a physical fact. So I reached for the edge of the tank, and I pulled myself up, and I climbed out onto the cabin floor, and I let it happen. I won't describe it in full. Some things are private, even in a story you're choosing to tell. I'll tell you it took a long time. I'll tell you that Thorn was on the floor next to me in seconds. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask, just moved and was there, and he stayed there, with one hand on my back and his voice steady and low, talking to me in the unhurried way he'd never once talked to anyone on deck. No commands, no efficiency, just words. Just the sound of his voice like a rope to hold on to while everything restructured itself. I'll tell you that when it was over, I was lying on the cabin floor on 2 human legs, gasping, with every nerve ending convinced it had just been born. And Thorn had his arms around me and his chin against the top of my head and was very carefully not saying anything at all. His heartbeat was very fast. Mine was faster. "Legs," I said when I had enough air for words. "Legs," he confirmed. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with command. "They feel strange." "They'll feel strange when you try to stand up." "How would you know?" "I don't." A pause. "But you're not trying to stand up yet." No, I wasn't. I was lying on the floor of a pirate ship wrapped in the arms of its captain, with 2 brand new legs and a heartbeat that had stopped being afraid somewhere in the past few minutes. And I wasn't trying to stand up, and neither of us was suggesting that I should. I turned my head and found his shoulder and stayed there. He tightened his arms. We went up to the deck when the stars came out. His arm around my waist, practical, he'd said, while I was learning the legs, but he hadn't let go once the learning was over. And my hand against his chest, feeling the steadiness of him, the physical fact of his presence as ballast. The crew moved around us with the deliberate unnoticingness of people who had made a collective decision about what they were and weren't going to remark on. The sea was calm, the kind of calm that feels intentional, like the ocean is in a particular mood tonight and has decided to be kind. We sat against the main mast, his back against the wood and me against his side, his arm a constant weight across my shoulders. The stars were everywhere, the density of them that you only get this far from any coast, dusted thick across the dark in patterns I'd been learning to read since the first night in the hold. I found the constellation I'd named for him in my head in those early nights. I'd never told him about it. "I named a star cluster after you," I said. A pause. "Which one?" he said. "That one," I pointed. It looked like a scar. He was quiet for a long moment. I could feel the quality of his breathing change just slightly. "That's not a flattering comparison," he said.
It wasn't meant to be flattering. It was meant to be accurate. I looked up at him, his face in profile against the stars, the jaw and the scar and the particular weight of his expression looking outward at the water like he always had. Except he wasn't scanning it tonight. He wasn't watching the horizon with the alert, tactical attention of a man who trusted nothing that he couldn't see coming. He was just looking, just resting his eyes on it. He looked like a man who had put something down. "I've been at sea since I was 13, he said. "Not to me exactly, to the water, to the night, the way you say things you've carried a long time. 21 years. I know every current, every route, every port that'll take a ship like mine without asking questions." A pause. "I know the ocean better than I know anything else." "I know," I said. "But I've never—" He stopped. His jaw worked. I waited because I knew by now that Thorne said the things that mattered slowly, the way ships move through heavy water, with effort, with intention, with the full commitment of something that doesn't turn back easily once it's moving. "I've never had a reason to stop," he said. My hand on his chest, over the steady knock of his heart. "And now?" I asked quietly. He looked down at me, gray eyes, deep water gray, and underneath, no current tonight, no hidden thing I couldn't name, just something open, something that had decided to stop being afraid of being seen. "And now," he said, "I have an anchor." His arm pulled me closer and I went, easily, like the word anchor had rearranged the logic of distance between us. My forehead found the curve of his jaw, his cheek came down against the top of my head. We fit together with the rightness of things that have been moving toward each other for a while, that arrive without fanfare, that settle into place like the sea settling after a storm. Not dramatic, not sudden, just here. Finally. Here. The ship moved beneath us, slow and breathing. The stars held their positions. The ocean went on in every direction, enormous and patient, the same ocean that had taken me apart and put me back together as something I hadn't expected to be, that had dropped me into a body built for depth and then, improbably, brought me to the surface, to this deck, to this man, who had been a monster in every story anyone told about him and had kept me alive and unchained and fed by hand and had stood between me and drawn swords and pressed his forehead to mine in the middle of a battle and made me a promise in the plainest words he had, who had given me the key and the ocean and waited to see what I'd choose. I chose him. He chose me back in the quiet, certain, irrevocable way he made all his decisions, without announcement, without performance, with his whole self behind it and no intention of reversing course. The pirate king who conquered 3 seas and burned 100 ships and never once in 21 years found a reason to stop. Stopped. Here. Because of a merman who used to study fish and now had legs and a star cluster named after a scar and a heart that had been making decisions without consulting his brain since approximately the moment he'd looked through storm-dark water at a drowning man and fought, "Not today." I pressed my palm flat against his chest. His heart beat under it, steady and real. Not today, I thought. Not any day. "Hey," I said softly. "I'm gonna need you to teach me to walk properly." A pause. Then, quietly, rough-edged, the rarest sound I'd heard on this ship. He laughed. Not the controlled social performance of amusement, a real laugh, low and unguarded that moved through his chest under my hand like a second heartbeat. I felt it all the way through me. I thought, There it is. There's the thing the armor was protecting. Worth it, I thought. Every storm,
Every chain, every moment of it. Worth it. The end.